Well, Andrew, you have over the years made music under several names, and I'm curious why you've taken that approach. Are there themes involved with these different names? Are they projects that are in some way separate from one another?
I I suspect there's some kind of deeply troubling psychological basis to the fact that I'm avoiding using my own name. Actually, I did put something out this year. Was it this year? Maybe the end of last year on Accidental Records, which is Matthew Herbert's record label, and that was actually the first time I think I'd been under my own name, but that was sort of accidental because they just titled it. But yeah, I've always gone for pseudonyms. I actually like making up names. That's probably the simple. I like the riddlesome way. I love band names. I think they're a great thing. So I kind of like the idea of coming up with a new one. Although this one, the Dark Jazz Project, I guess, was an attempt to literally just describe sort of what it was, rather than sort of saying, like with Sadman, I had to make quite a bit of work just to kind of say, well, this is sort of what Sadman sounds like. Whereas I suppose with the Dark Jazz Project, it was like, okay, you've got the word dark, you've got the word jazz, and you've got the word project. So that kind of pretty much scopes out the remit of the project, I suppose.
Come
So
back to
yeah,
that. Come back to that in a moment. But you've recorded a piece for Mortality Tables under your own name. That's
yeah,
come out.
yeah. I think, I mean, to quite honest, I think what's happening to me is that I have for a long time avoided being me, but I'm becoming more comfortable with it. So I think, yeah, doing Accidental Records, then Mortality Tables, I think is sort of a sign of the future, maybe that I'm getting to a point where I might well be prepared to, brand myself, if you know what I mean. But yeah, I'm getting there. I'm working through it. It's only taken quite a lot of years, but I'm working my way through it.
Let's talk about Dark Jazz Project. I was going to ask you about the name because I don't hear a jazz influence. Sounds like you have one in mind, though.
I mean, I think it's twofold. I mean, I think I'm being a little bit cheeky, um, poking a little bit, not in a mean-spirited way, but just kind of. I suppose I felt that jazz was a genre, if that had a wide open door, and I wanted to kind of enter that door and do something in it, because I've got a lot of interest in that world. So, but admittedly, I don't sound really that much like some of those things. I think a lot of the album was made through improvisation, so I think there's sort of some of the creation sensibilities are definitely there. And I've done quite a lot of sort of live electronics and improvisation. I think that's kind of the spirit of the album, even though obviously you don't really recognize perhaps, or it's hard to recognize specific things that are jazz like maybe. But yeah, I mean, all these genres are kind of interesting, aren't they? I like the idea of genres, and then I like the idea of crossing genres because, they're a way to sort of simplify people's understanding of what they're getting as a product. And for some reason, every time I attempt to kind of enter a genre in a sort of purest possible way, and I've done it with other things before, I seem to fail dismally of being exactly the right fit. I'm sort of always generally a kind of square peg in a round hole, and that's not me being necessarily contrary. It's just accidental that I sort of want to belong, I think, to these institutions, but really at the end of the day, I sort of, it always just ends up coming out the way it comes out. So yeah, that's the
Not a
bottom
bad
line of that. But
That's not a bad
yeah,
artistic statement. An accidental square peg.
an accidental square peg, yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. The label this is on is called Irregular Patterns, and that wasn't my choice. That was, we just came together because I think they reached out, or we somehow met. They're based in Bristol in the UK, which is a great musical city, and it's where I used to live. And there's such great musical artists come out of Bristol. But it's weird that they're called Irregular Patterns. That again suggests that I was specifically trying to be irregular, but I wasn't on this occasion. But
I wonder if you could help us understand the pseudonyms by just comparing Dark Jazz Project with Sadman. What are the differences and what are the connection points between the two, given that they're both yours?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think when I was Sadman went on for about 5 years, and at the end of the 5 year span, I felt like I was getting to this point where I was trying to replicate myself to some degree. I was trying to sort of create something that I'd already created. And I think I became quite frustrated by that because it felt like a straitjacket that I'd made for myself, and I wanted that to sort of end. So when the Dark Jazz Project sort of happened, or I titled it that was a sort of signal that I just wanted to just really be free to do anything and not be constrained by my own rules and things that I sort of painted myself into a corner over. Interesting enough, on this album, when I first started making it back in June, I think I did regress quite a bit, and there was even this kind of thought in my mind, am I going back to the Sadman days a little bit? And then as it progressed, it sort of moved further back into what I'd call Dark Jazz Project sort of territory. And so it's now like this double album. So it's the first half of the album's a little bit more user friendly, and then it just really kind of the kind of stabilizers just come off completely, I think, and it just starts to unravel in a kind of weird way, and I kind of think I like it. Sort of represents both sides of my personality. I quite, I could listen. I don't listen back that much to the stuff, but when I do listen back, sometimes I listen to the first half and I think, oh yeah, that's a nice little package up piece. I want to make more stuff like that, lots of beats and lots of kind of, sort of more structural and short 3-minute pieces. And then when I listen to the sort of 10-minute pieces on the second half, I'm like, oh no, this is definitely me. These kind of noisy, expansive kind of things going on. So I'm kind of like, I am the personality of that album, really, I think. Those two conflicting, competing elements going at each other, hammer and tongs. But
it's an interesting thing for a multimedia artist. There is this sort of multi-dimensional aspect to everything that you do. That fair?
Well, what do you mean in terms of the other things, the sort of visual things and the other bits? I think so. Yeah. I mean, I wanted to do something more with this album as well. I mean, I think I mentioned this before when I contacted you, but I wrote a play to go with this album, not at the time I was making the album, but retrospectively, and then kind of sequence tracks from the album into the play because I sort of saw it as that's how I basically listened to the album and I wrote on my phone as I was listening, and I was literally just kind of stream of consciousness writing this play as I was listening to tracks, and as I broke it down into scenes, it was literally like another track. What could that be? So the play really is based on the album, but it wasn't my intention going into the album. I mean, it was kind of like a later thought, but yeah, I wanted to give it another life, beyond just music, I suppose. And and visually, I wanted to kind of play around with visuals a bit more on this one. I mean, by trade, I'm a graphic designer and illustrator, so it would make sense to kind of play around in those sort of areas and stuff.
Sure. But it suggests a kind of hyper creativity that I get a sense of with your practice. And I'm curious about the motivation to try to tackle so many different things in so many different mediums. And is that ever, are there difficulties involved with that? Does that ever make?
Yeah, I mean, I think for a while, yeah. That makes sense. For a while, I sort of backed away from doing too much on the visual side because I really wanted to just focus completely on music. And I think now that I've slightly, with the Dark Jazz Project, I've given me a bit more license to be freer to just do what I want, really. So I've tended to kind of go back to doing bits of visual things and other things with it. So I suppose I have kind of broadened out. But yeah, I'm not saying it's not easy doing. I mean, in some senses, it's. I mean, I really like doing lots of different things. It's probably for me harder to stick on one thing than it is to do many things. I'm not suggesting for a second I'm doing any of those things well, but I'm spreading myself too thin. But I probably, like, my default position is just to do lots of creative output, and I get very excited about things. That's generally the front end of a project. I'm super excited, and then my interest wanes as it goes on. I mean, I've been sitting on this album for a long time, so I needed to kind of find new things in it to kind of reinvigorate sort of parts of my interest and stuff. So yeah, I mean, like I say, it's actually easier for me to do lots of things. It's probably harder for me to stick to, doing one thing, which is kind of what I did in the Sadman days. Was I literally just went, right, focus on the next album, focus on that, and I'm still doing that. Music is still my primary output. Still is still what I find easiest to do. Actually, really, I find it not easy, but that's not to say I'm making anything good, but it comes easy,
Mm.
or the way I do it does for me. That's not to say that it's not frustrating, but
There is a kind of energy that comes from new and exciting projects. I can certainly relate to that. Um, I'm curious about the um, lack of a better term, the difficulty that I perceive in some of the dark jazz work. And I mean that complimentary. Like, there are challenging listens, um, certainly on this new double LP. Um, what what motivates you to produce music like that? Do you just kind of land there because you're following the work, or is there something more purposeful that you're attempting to do?
um I probably could answer it two ways. I think the first way is that literally I'm shaping the work. I mean, it is like clay or paint. I am just working through the sort of micro problems in the creation of stuff. A bit like a kind of collage artist would perhaps, and I'm just kind of working instinctively in that. So that to some degree, I'm not deliberately setting out to make it difficult. It's just is what it is. But then I guess the other thing is, I like the fact it's this particular album is hard work. You might want to call it that, or it's involving or something like that, because I did want to deliberately make something that would not necessarily appeal, but would be relevant to an audience who was prepared to give it a bit of time. And I think where I was before was in that 3 minute, let's hook people in. If they're bored within the first X amount of seconds, they've skipped over and then on the next one or on the next one. I'm sure that still happens. I mean, that's fair enough. But I sort of wanted to kind of produce something that people may sit and listen to and go, oh my God, I feel absolutely wrung out at the end of this. Or it was a challenge, it was a bit challenging to go through the whole album. I mean, I have produced quite a lot of music, but I don't know if I've ever made something that's as long as 20 tracks before. And
Mm.
with I think it runs 2 hours. I mean, it's quite a beast, really. And I just enjoyed making it. It just was interesting and fun and engaging while I was making it. And I sort of hope, that maybe when people, if they can spare the time, because obviously time is the thing that people aren't able to give things these days. And that's the bit you were all fighting over, isn't it? People's attention time. But if there is a set of people out there who can find time, I think it could be a deep dive. It could be interesting for them.
Yeah, for sure. And
But
it
yeah,
certainly
let's see.
pairs with the first dark
Yeah.
jazz record in that sense. It seems to me that you create this kind of space when you start these new projects. It's like you create a space within which you're going to work, and so there are sort of parameters around that. And so I'm curious, as you're composing and writing, creating music within those parameters, are you conscious of the fact that this is clearly not commercial music? And does that even occur to you as you're creating creating work?
Oh yeah, I mean, I'd absolutely love to make commercial music. No two questions about it. If I could be, I don't know, Fortet or Kelly Lee Owens or one of these people who makes things that really clicks with people
Mhm.
instantly and has great radio friendliness and stuff. I'd love that. Obviously but it's not easy to do that either. I mean, that's harder than it first appears. Um, but it's really just kind of how it comes out, I think. And I do, when I'm making the music, just to kind of say a little bit about the sort of process, is initially I will literally be just kind of doing kind of improvisation sessions, or I'll be putting things together, or I'll be just seeking out sounds. A lot of this was made with no input mixing. So I'd just be kind of experimenting with stuff, really, equipment and things, and have a lot of stuff, really. And then I think when it's then constructed into maybe more sort of logical, semi-logical tracks or whatever, it's a bit like a painting. It's like I mixed up a ton of paint, and now I'm going to kind of make the paintings, and I probably work on more than one painting at the same time. So I'm kind of like dabbing a bit of that there, and I get a chunk and I go, let's stuff that over there. And it's not actually that logical. It's not like I'm going, oh, that would sound really nice with that. In some ways, I'm kind of going, what if I lift this chunk of stuff, this musical stuff, and I stick it next to this other musical stuff that I've kind of created? Those two things are probably not going to sit well together. They're probably going to be very awkward, but that's going to be a lot more interesting for me to wrangle my way around to make that happen than it would be for things that sort of very feel harmonious or good fits. A bit like if you were I mean, I do quite a lot of collage stuff. But it's the same sort of thing. If you cut something out, you don't want to put it next to that's blue and you put it next to another blue. It's sort of insipid. You want to basically get something that's just completely wrong and shouldn't be together in a million years, and then work out, how can I solve that problem? How can I make this work in some way? And sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But that's what's interesting in the process for me, I guess, is not making it easy for myself, really.
Mhm.
That's probably important. Otherwise, it's not that, it wouldn't be as engaging as a practice, I suppose. But
Yeah, what is it about that that you find engaging or perhaps even inspirational? There's a kind of conflict there.
yeah, I mean, I suppose, I mean, I'm sort of a problem solver, I suppose. I like practical problems to solve, sort of quite a practical person. So, once you've kind of created the material, then and you move on to this problem solving phase, I suppose I just like making it difficult and thinking, well, you know, is there a solution or isn't there a solution? Or actually, making things that perhaps don't work so well, but actually what happens when you put those things into the public arena? I mean, quite a lot of people spend a lot of time making things that they feel will be right for their audience, and I did that with Spackman to some degree. This is sort of a process of saying, well, what if you were to listen to something or experience something that isn't right at all? It's completely wrong. Would your experience of that be a lot more interesting? You know, so I guess that's sort of it. I mean, I'm not suggesting it's coming from quite an arty perspective. It's not. It's coming from a sort of more of a sort of punky sort of a perspective, I suppose, to some degree. But
Well, the distinction I hear is a focus more internal than external, more focused on the project and the work and where your improvisations take you, as opposed to how that might be perceived, what a particular audience might be interested in.
yeah, I mean, audience is a kind of interesting one because obviously making work that's both difficult and very difficult to package in terms of genre isn't the most pleasant thing to do when you're that end of it, I suppose, when you're at the end of trying to sell it or market it or persuade people to kind of get involved in it. It does get a bit tricky then, I think. But yeah, I think, I mean, I'm making what I want to make. What I found, I think, earlier on or in different phases of my musical creative life is that you can try to make things that you think people want, and you can fail equally as you would if you make things that people don't like. But as long as you've made it with a spirit of sort of adventure and interest and engagement, at least you're going to walk away with it yourself, so at least I please one person, which is me. And then everything else is going to be a bonus on top of that if people kind of like a bit of it or some of it. But yeah, I guess, yeah, it's never going to be a great crowd pleaser, but
it has a longevity to it. I think work of this nature does stick in a way. It may reach a more narrow audience, perhaps even a smaller audience, but those that attach themselves to it tend to regard it, highly for the long term. And I think
yeah,
about some of my favorite records, they were not instant hits in my mind.
yeah, yeah. I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? Often my favorite albums and would be ones that the first or second or the third listen was unremarkable or unpleasant, but for some reason I felt compelled to go back to it. An example of that might be, I remember like when I was very young, a younger person, I just got someone introduced me to the band the
Oh yeah.
and I didn't click with it at all, initially. I really worked hard to try and get into it, and then once it's set in my bones, so to speak, I was a bit like, well, how could I be without this music now? It's absolutely so I think, yeah, there's a bit of a learning process, isn't there, with some things that you need to give them a bit more time. And like I was saying a bit before, time is the thing that no one really wants to give up at the moment. Ironically, we spend hours, me included, scrolling through Instagram, wasting time looking at little cats playing with balls of fluff and stuff, but then won't afford the time to do something perhaps that would be more meaningful and interesting. But I'm as guilty as the next person doing that.
I think we're all struggling with that right
Yeah.
now.